All right, hello and welcome to UX Gym's first ever web seminar. I'm Matt Gould. I am a director and designer at user experience agency Lushai, and I'm a course designer and facilitator at our design education initiative UX Gym. So while we're not able to do our normal public courses teaching human-centered design during the lockdown, we're going to take a few of our favorite methods and principles and share them for free in these web seminars, basically for as long as the lockdown lasts. So there are two ways you can interact with us. If you're watching this on YouTube live, then you'll see there's a little chat section there. And if you post any questions during the stream in the chat, I'm happy to answer those. Otherwise, once the stream is finished at 2:30, we'll be having a public Zoom to answer any questions you may have. So if you're watching this on YouTube, refresh the page after the stream finishes, and in the description will be a link to the Zoom. If you're watching it on the UX Gym website, then look underneath the video, again refresh the page once the stream's finished, and there will be a link to that Zoom. We're just putting that in a little bit later to avoid Zoom bombing. I think that's about it. So yeah, let's get started. When we decided to do this series of webinars, one of the first questions we asked was, what do we see our clients or stakeholders doing that we think they could do a little bit better? And one of the first things that came up as a really common experience is that when we're working from insights into users or customers that clients have derived themselves, once we see the design of the research that generated those insights, we don't feel super confident that we can really rely on those insights as being accurate or truly representative. And usually this is because of the design of the research itself. So there's usually one or two things that will have gone wrong. So first of all, in the case of an interview, the design of the questions that inform the interview are designed in such a way that they are likely to get the responses that our clients are looking for. So it's going to tell them what they want to hear, as opposed to necessarily what the reality is. And the second one is that the design of the questions creates responses that are too shallow to really feel confident that we're getting a good understanding of the drivers and needs of those people. So the method we're going to be talking about today is designed to minimize those unintentional biases and also to create or generate deeper conversations and deeper responses to questions as opposed to shallower responses. But first of all, let's talk about the principles that inform the method to make sure you've got a good understanding of it for when you start trying to use it. Our first principle is that deep user insights most commonly come from stories. So you probably have a couple of quite specific things you feel you need to know in order to make good design decisions. Things like, what's the hardest thing about using this product? Or where do you go for help if you're having trouble with our service? Or do you ever use your phone to pay your bill or to buy groceries, or whatever your questions are? So we've found that asking for a narrative or a story about an experience gets us a better quality of response. So instead of asking, what is the hardest thing about using our product or service, we might say, tell me the story of a time you've had difficulty using our product or service. Or even better, tell me about the last time you used our product or service. So I realize that this is a kind of convoluted and indirect way to get that information. In the second example, we're not even asking for a difficult story, we're just asking for any kind of story. There are a couple of good reasons why, even though we're asking for a specific story, we start with these broad invitations to tell us a narrative. So firstly, often the information that turns out to be the most important isn't information we expected to find. So we definitely want a script because there are specific things we need to find out. And also we need to put multiple interviews together, so we need a certain level of consistency between each interview. But what we don't want is a script that is so tight that we're not able to respond to unexpected things and improvise questions based on what we're finding through our earlier conversation. What we really want is an interview that feels more like a conversation than a question and answer kind of interview. This kind of interview is called a semi-structured interview. So we definitely have a script. We have set questions or conversation starters that we're going to use that will be consistent across every interview, but there's a lot of flexibility built into it for us to respond in whatever way we think is best to get the quality of information we need to inform either our report or our design decisions, depending on what the final output of your interview is going to be. Our second principle is that unsolicited information is more valuable than coerced information. So it's pretty natural that during a conversation, you want the other person to feel comfortable, not to feel anxious. In any conversation, we're always editing our responses in a way that is inclusive of the other person and will make the person feel good about being in the conversation. So this happens in an interview as well. Whenever someone responds to a question you've given them, it's going through that filter of what does this person need to feel comfortable. In the case of an interview, it's what information do they need to do a good job, to say that that was a successful interview. So if you ask a leading question, and in that question, you give someone a clue as to what you're looking for. For example, you say, tell me about a way this product has been disappointing for you or frustrating to you. I won't lie to you, but I will go through my experiences and pull out the experiences that I think are giving you the information that you want. And in a worst case scenario, I might even exclude experiences that I think are not giving you the information that you want. So if we can get information from a story where we haven't given too many clues about what we're looking for, where we've just given a very broad directive and the person has told us a really detailed story about a specific experience, then we can put a lot of weight on the information that's coming through that story, as opposed to asking a direct question and knowing that there's been some heavy filtering going on before we've managed to get the response to that question. One more principle that will inform what we're going to do: past behavior is more predictive than speculation about future behavior. So a lot of research has shown that we are terrible at understanding our own decision-making processes, and we are terrible at predicting our own future behavior. So as an example, a year or so back, a couple of years back, we did some research on how people engage with content about science and the environment. And we had a couple of questions we asked them. One was predicting future behavior. What kind of content are you likely to engage with and share on Facebook? Another one was around current behavior, so your framework. What makes you decide to share something? What do you think about when you're looking at content? And what kind of decision-making process do you go through when you share something? Now, in both of those conversations, the answer we got in most cases was, I like to share things that are positive. That Facebook is a cesspool of negativity and disaster, and I really want to share something that will inspire people and make them feel good. Directly after those questions, we would say, can we look at your Facebook feed and see the last few things that you've shared? And in almost every case, the things they had shared were disasters, negative stories, complaints, just one cataclysmic, abysmal event after another. So the people we were interviewing were genuinely surprised at the difference between what they thought they shared and then what their history showed they'd actually shared. So that's, I guess, it's just a story that can in some ways demonstrate the difference between what we think we're going to do and then what we actually do, and why we can't rely too heavily on trying to predict our own future behavior. So going back to our idea about stories, the most useful thing you can do is get someone to tell you a very specific story about something they've done in the past. The more specific, the better. But again, it all comes back to this generating narratives, generating stories about specific things that have happened in the past so that we can get high quality responses to our questions. By high quality, we mean minimizing the bias of those responses and also getting deep stories as opposed to shallow stories. Okay, so with all of those principles floating around in our head, let's actually get down to the method, a method you can use to generate really good interview questions or an interview structure. So for this, I'm armed with the two cliches of user experience. I've got Post-its, I've got a Sharpie, and we'll take you through this method. So this method is called assumption-based interview design, and it's got two steps. The first step is to declare all of our assumptions. That is everything we would expect to find if we went and interviewed someone. And the second step is to design questions or really more prompts or conversations that will find out if those assumptions were correct or not. So let's look at step one, declaring your assumptions. So this is sometimes called assumption mapping. And what we do is literally write down everything we expect to find when we do an interview. And there are two reasons why we do this. The first reason is because it's very easy if you just write down the questions you want to ask to go out into the field and find out that actually there are some really important areas that you've completely missed out. So by starting with listing all the things you expect to find, you'll find that you've got a much more comprehensive base for designing your interview question. You're much less likely to leave out a really important area that just didn't occur to you until later on. So the second reason is to mitigate confirmation bias. So we already talked about how a lot of the poorly constructed research designs we saw generated questions that were highly likely to get the person doing the interview the response that they expected to hear. So this is because of confirmation bias. And confirmation bias, and it's something that we all do, something we all do all the time. If we see some evidence that backs up something we already believe, then we're more likely to notice it and internalize it. If we see some kind of evidence that negates something that's important to us or that we believe or want to believe, we're more likely to dismiss it or rationalize it away. So confirmation bias affects us in interview design as well. What it means is that we inadvertently design questions that are more likely to confirm what we want to believe. So by listing all of our assumptions right at the start, we can become more cognizant of the things we expect to find, all of our assumptions, and therefore when we're designing the questions and when we're facilitating the interview and when we're analyzing the interview, we're much less likely to be influenced by that confirmation bias. Now you can't completely eradicate confirmation bias at all, but you can at least minimize it. So let's put this method into practice using this scenario of discovering how people engage with content about science and the environment. So my first assumption is going to be that people are more likely to engage with content if it has some kind of dramatic media attached to it. So I would write this on a post-it, and literally I would stick it on my wall. And I would keep doing this, writing down more and more assumptions until I have basically exhausted all of my ideas about what I would expect to find in an interview. Again, this is called assumption mapping, and the idea is that by the time I've finished, the whole wall or several walls or several phone call boards, however you do it, will be filled with all of the assumptions you have about what you expect to find when you go into an interview. That's what sets the stage for step 2. Okay, so for step 2, let's pretend now that I've gone through this exercise and now I have a wall or multiple walls full of these speculations or these assumptions about what I'm going to find. So my first assumption here is people are more likely to share content with dramatic media. So now what I need to do is create a question or a prompt for conversation that will let me know if this assumption was accurate or not. So I guess the first thing I could ask is, tell me about what attracted your attention to that content. But if you think about our earlier principles, I really want to start with the broadest prompt possible. So even though I'm after specific questions, I want to give as broad a direction as possible. So actually even better than tell me what attracted your attention to that content, where I'm directing them to think about what it was that caught their eye, I want to go even broader. So I'll make my first question, tell me the story of the last time you shared something on social media. So hopefully with this broader directive for a conversation, as they're telling me that story, they will volunteer without coercing from me what it was that caught their attention and how they felt about the media that was attached to that content, whether that had any influence on their decision. Now, if they don't ever mention the media, that's when I've got now up my sleeve this second question of tell me what attracted your attention to that content. And if they still don't talk about media, I've got another one here. It's even more specific. So obviously any information that comes out of this conversation has more weight to me because I haven't directly prompted for it, but I can still make sure that I get the information that I need. So when I go to the next interview, I have information I can put together from interview to interview. And you'll see it just narrows down in specificity. So let's look at the second one. The second one is a lot harder generally because it's people share content that makes them look good. It's the idea that you share content because you think it will reflect well on you. So here I'm asking someone for their perception about how other people perceive them. So generally speaking, I can't have as much confidence in whatever I find here as I can in whatever I find here because I can listen to a story about what happened to get this information. This information I'm relying on a little bit of self-analysis and perceptions about perceptions. So I just can't have as much confidence in it. But I should still find out some useful information. So I might find that in answering this first question or talking about this first story, they naturally talk about this anyway, which is great. That's really high value information. And you'll often find that your broad opening question will cover many of your other questions that you generate as you're designing your research. Now, if they don't mention it, I obviously need something I can use to make sure I do get that information. So I might use something like, tell me about how you think people will feel when they see it. I'm not talking about how they will feel about you specifically, but I am narrowing it down a little bit. And again, if they still don't talk about how people will perceive them, I've got a backup question here. How do you think people will feel about you when they see that content? Now, because it's a semi-structured interview, as well as finding out whether these specific assumptions are correct or not, I'll also hopefully find out lots of other details that I wasn't anticipating, and I can improvise and respond to that information as it comes in. But this is basically how the method works. You write down all of your assumptions, you pick the assumptions you think are most interesting or most important, and then you create conversation prompts or questions that will generate stories that will prove or disprove that assumption. And if you get really lucky, you'll have one broad directive, and the natural conversation that flows out of that will answer all of the questions that you needed to find. So one more time, step 1, declare your assumptions, write down everything you expect to find. Step 2, write some questions or prompts for stories where you can tell if that assumption is true or not true by the details of that story. And what you want is a chain of questions, because you want to go as broad as possible, so broad that you're not specifically talking about what you're interested in at all. And then if they don't voluntarily or naturally bring up the information you want, you've got this chain of backup questions in your pocket that you can turn to make sure you get all the information you need by the time the interview is finished. This video will be available on YouTube, so feel free to revisit it and feel free to share it. And if you want to get a notification when the next one comes out, go to uxgym.com, go to the bottom of the page. You can subscribe to the newsletter, and we will pump out a newsletter whenever we put one of these out to let people know it's up, and obviously on our Twitter and Facebook and all that kind of thing. You can find out when we do updates. This is a method we use in a wide range of projects. We use it in UX projects, we use it in service design projects. It's not the only method we use when we're creating an interview, but it's definitely a very useful one. So coming up next is our question and answer session. So once this video is finished, one more time, if you're on YouTube, refresh the page, the link will be in the description. If you're on uxgym.com, refresh the page and the link will be underneath the video. And yeah, if you've been watching this live, then hopefully see you soon in the Zoom. Otherwise, I guess talk to you next time. Thanks.